It's very obvious that Amazon is panicking, that they are extremely desperate to try to prop up this show, Rings of Power, as much as they can and try to keep it alive as they release yet another hit piece targeting fans with The Hollywood Reporter. We're going to get into this whole story here, see what they have to say, because they literally have the showrunners doing an interview here, and yes, the showrunners do attack the fans in some pretty egregious claims. So let's get into all of this here. Rings of Power showrunners break silence on Backlash, Sauron, and Season 2. So we have, as of the making of this video, we have 2 episodes left to go of the first season for Rings of Power, and it hasn't gotten any better. The show has been just so bad on many levels. It's very obvious that the people who were in charge of making Rings of Power had no idea what they were doing whatsoever, and we're gonna find out that in this article here, the showrunners literally admit to that. So let's get into this whole thing. 2 first-time showrunners who landed TV's biggest series. By the way, this is absolutely insane. First-time showrunners who landed TV's biggest series. You're literally giving TV's biggest series of all time to 2 first-time showrunners who literally worked in Hollywood for 10 years and no one wanted to pick up any of their shit to make. Gave The Hollywood Reporter a behind-the-scenes tour as they navigate challenges even scarier than Mordor, from patently evil online trolling to massive industry expectations. This is where everything happens, says showrunner Patrick McKay. The War Room! The large windowless room centerpiece is a lengthy conference table, but your eyes are immediately transfixed by what's covering the walls. You're surrounded by concept art, laying out major set pieces for The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2! Which, of course, you know, probably looks decent-ish from a far distance back, looking at all of that type of stuff. But when you start to actually look into the design of the world of Rings of Power, it looks like total crap. The armor looks plastic. Nothing feels like it's actually authentic and lived in or anything. It all feels like it's coming from a set. It feels like a set. It just does, okay? Everything about the show is just continuing to prove that they have no idea what they're doing in making a Lord of the Rings show. And especially when you then go and compare Rings of Power to House of the Dragon. House of the Dragon has so much more depth to it when it comes to the costumes, when it comes to the props, when it comes to the sets. Everything feels like it's legit. It has weight to it. You don't feel that same way when it comes to Rings of Power. Since Amazon's billion-dollar high fantasy launch September 2nd, The Rings of Power has been blessed with strong critical acclaim. 84% positive on Rotten Tomatoes. I'm sure, you know, those are all just super genuine people who just love the show. No woke critics whatsoever. And dragged by online fan bashing. Its audience score is 39%, which includes an unknown degree of review bombing at the hands of internet trolls. By the way, don't forget that the critics also loved The Last Jedi from the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Meanwhile, fans absolutely despised it. And yet, who turned out to be right about Star Wars at the end? The fans. The fans were right. Fans didn't go out and continue to support the garbage that they were getting in theaters, which is why we're at a point where Disney and Lucasfilm are actually literally canceling films that were supposed to be coming out in theaters. The last film that we got that came out in theaters for Star Wars was, I believe, Rise of the Skywalker, right? Rise of Skywalker. That was the last one. It's been years since we've gotten a Star Wars film in theaters. The fans are right. Doesn't matter what the critics say. Which includes an unknown degree of review bombing at the hands of internet trolls. The show's Nielsen viewership is formidable. Its first 2 episodes were seen by roughly 12.6 million US viewers across its first 4 days, which no one was surprised by that. Of course, its views were going to be good for the first 2 episodes in its first 4 days. But Even with going from episode 1 to episode 2, you could see a decline already in the viewership, which is just really funny. But given this is Lord of the Rings, the bar is insanely high, and nobody knows the stakes better than Payne and McKay. They're two first-time showrunners who embarked on an unexpected journey nearly 5 years ago to make their J.R.R. Tolkien passion project, and have now found themselves, as McKay puts it, on the fault line of the culture war, with everybody from armies of anonymous Tolkien fans to the two richest men in the world weighing in. It ain't easy to focus on writing scripts and managing a cast and crew of 1,300 on the most complicated TV production of all time when Elon Musk is slagging you on Twitter, which is still one of the most glorious things that has happened to this whole show. Some of what's been hardest to hear is the cynical point of view that this is a cash grab, McKay says. It's like, OMG, the opposite. This is the most earnest production. This is not a paycheck for anybody. This is a labor of love. Do you really believe that? I don't. I don't believe that for a second. When it comes to Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson's trilogy, yes, I believe that. When you actually watch the behind the scenes of Lord of the Rings, yes, you can see that there's actual passion, actual people that actually cared about honoring Tolkien and what they were creating. You can't say the same thing for Rings of Power. Like, Galadriel from Rings of Power is not Tolkien's Galadriel. Not even close. She doesn't even come close to Tolkien's Galadriel. But that's okay, because the showrunners are trying to tell Rings of Power through a modern lens. The showrunners first met in junior high in Northern Virginia and became friends when they joined the debate team at high school. They moved to LA and spent years toiling in the screenwriting game without a big win. Seems like that would be kind of a red flag. Their previous gig was at Bad Robot, where they punched up scripts and developed several projects, such as an abandoned Star Trek movie. We had reached a point. We've been writing movies for 10 years that should have gotten made, McKay says. Movies where the director was right, the cast was right, the script was right, the title was right, and it was a big IP, and it still wasn't happening. So we thought maybe we should try this TV thing. So literally, they're admitting here that they worked in Hollywood for 10 years, trying to get projects made that no one wanted. Nobody wanted their shit. And yet, Amazon thought it would be a brilliant idea to hand them freaking Lord of the Rings. Oh, man. What a joke. Seriously, what was Amazon thinking? Like, I do not understand, even from a pragmatic perspective, why they would do that. In their Amazon pitch, Payne emphasized their show would be Braveheart, not Narnia. You want it real and lived in. What? What does that even mean? I can tell you one thing. Lion and the Witch in the Wardrobe, the Narnia film that came out in, 2005 or something? That, was made by the guy who directed Shrek, feels way more real and lived in than Rings of Power does. It doesn't even come close. It was such a big ask on short notice, they briefly considered canceling the meeting, but the writers embarked on a marathon brainstorming session where they cracked what would become their show's major storylines. And as we have continued to watch the season 1, it's not good. When that session of fevered creativity and inspiration ended, we had a moment of silence, McKay recalls. I looked at the board like, that's it. This is what the show wants to be. Well, I guess the show just wanted to be a complete disaster then, didn't it? The duo walked into their second Amazon meeting with full confidence, and then, well, we did 7 more pitches, McKay says. At one point, Payne and McKay asked mentor and former boss J.J. Abrams to call Amazon to put in a good word, and he did. We feel like that moved the needle, says McKay. Yet the deciding factor was their flesh-out story and passion for it and depth of knowledge of Tolkien's world. Sure. Amazon's programming team, with Amazon Studios chief Jennifer Salke now shepherding Rings, kept coming back to the same conclusion. The guys with perhaps the least experience were also the best choice. You know who else said a very similar thing? When Aragon the movie came out in, what was that, like 2005 or something? 2006? You know, the movie Aragon? Yeah, the guy that directed Aragon literally never directed a movie in his life. Yet he still had more experience making films than these guys did because he actually worked in the visual effects department, but he literally never directed a movie in his life. And they decided that he was the best choice to make Aragon. We all saw how that turned out, right? Not saying that there aren't directors that can't be first-time directors that can do a great job. Like, seriously, you could have found anybody that could have done a better job with this show than these guys did when it comes to Rings of Power. The first season's episodes, the team believes, improves as the season progresses. Literally, they're just admitting here that the show is terrible, and it started out terrible. The show's September 30th 6th episode, its most recent, is its highest rated yet on IMDb, which was still an awful episode. I literally fell asleep during the fight scene for this episode. The only thing that made this episode somewhat tolerable to a lot of casual normies out there is the fact that they basically just ripped off a lot of elements from Lord of the Rings, like the whole fight having to do with, you know, the Southerners trying to fight against the Southlanders trying to fight against the orcs and everything else. That's literally just Helm's Deep. Like, every element of that episode you could find from different things from Lord of the Rings that they just basically copied and pasted and then put their little Rings of Power spin on. McKay says that the aim of season 2, which quietly started filming October 3rd at Bray Studios, is to be bigger and better on every level by an order of magnitude. Some things get an immense amount of critical acclaim and win tons of awards and are forgotten the next year, Payne says. Conversely, some things don't get a lot of love, yet become classics being watched 60 years later. I think it'll take a while for the dust to settle. I'm sorry, there's no one that's going to be watching this show in 60 years. Like, that's not going to be a thing. Yet Amazon has long known they were in for a rather bumpy series takeoff. They saw Tolkien fans slamming the Rings of Power online before a frame had been released. We all saw it coming. There were no surprises, says Salke. Having insight into our global audience, we also have insight into the darker sides of how people can manipulate reviews and have other points of view that we wouldn't support. People having other points of view? How dare they! You must subscribe to Hollywood's narrative! If you don't, then you are a bad person. So ridiculous. But yeah, at the same time, there was a lot of people that were extremely excited to see what Amazon was going to be producing. I remember when they first announced that they were going to be making Rings of Power, I was very, very positive and very, very excited for what Amazon could make. Now look at where we're at. I mean, after we actually get to see some of the crap that they came out with, honestly, I was excited for the show all the way up until the Vanity Fair article, where the showrunners, the guys we're talking about here, literally in that article, said that they wanted to create the novel that Tolkien never wrote. And they basically just hinged a lot of the marketing of the show on their diversity and everything else. Those were major red flags that this show really didn't give a crap about honoring Tolkien. And that's when I knew that this show was going to be terrible. And indeed, I was incredibly correct about that. Amazon claims there's been a coordinated effort to attack the show for daring to diversify Tolkien with strong female characters and people of color. Daring to diversify Tolkien. Right there, that shows you that the showrunners, they will take liberties when they think that they need to in order to fit their own personal agendas, their own political views, and everything else. And this is one of the problems with this show. It's not the only problem. The writing is terrible. The set design is terrible. The costume design is terrible. The acting is pretty cringe. Everything. But this is one of the red flags that shows that the showrunners don't actually care that much about honoring Tolkien and what they're creating. It's an explanation that satisfied the media, but inflamed some fans who feel the company is dismissive of any criticism and arguably risked escalating what might have been a short-term dust-up into ongoing fandom trench warfare. As one wrote, "I'm tired of the constant media harangues from Amazon that you don't love the show, you're racist." I mean, are they wrong? Many point out HBO's House of the Dragon faced similar trolling for its diversity moves, yet its audience scores weren't impacted. This is one of the major differences between House of the Dragon and Rings of Power. When we first saw that they were both going to be taking these steps with diversity and everything else, it became red flags for fans, because we have seen the Hollywood game play out time and time again, where Hollywood puts this as the most important thing in their movies and shows, and then the story is terrible. We've seen it happen time and time again, ever since Ghostbusters 2016, possibly even before that. But then HBO delivered. They delivered us House of the Dragon, and fans warmed up to it. Fans was like, okay, the story is actually good. The characters are actually well written. Everything is progressing the way that it should when it comes to a show. It's very obvious that HBO put a lot of love and care into creating this show. That is the big difference between what has happened with House of the Dragon versus Rings of Power. They both have gone pretty much in opposite directions of each other. And then this is the real kicker of this entire interview here between the showrunners and Hollywood Reporter. Or take this fan's complaint. A Tolkien adaptation is a new age politically correct girl power garbage version of fantasy that's raping the text. That sounds like what's populating Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb right now, but it was actually quoted in Wired magazine in 2001 for a story about Tolkien fandom's reaction to Jackson's The Fellowship of the Ring, which was honestly just like one very cherry-picked type of response that they found. But getting into this is what the showrunners have to say to kind of tie up this whole thing. Payne looks particularly distressed by the topic. The spirit of Tolkien is about disparate people who don't understand one another and look different from one another, which you literally already had in Lord of the Rings. You didn't need to expound on that. You had elves, you had dwarves, you had hobbits, you had men, you had Ents, you had eagles. You have all of these different races that are completely different in looks to each other. You already had the diversity in the show that you didn't need to then put through a modern lens. The spirit of Tolkien is about disparate people who don't trust one another and look different from one another, finding common ground in friendship and accomplishing big things. Literally, like I said, you can see that in the Fellowship of the Ring, right? The Fellowship, the actual Fellowship. Look how different they all look. That's the spirit we've tried to inculcate into every single comma and period in the show. That this aspiration would be offensive to people and enrage them, it's very hard for us to understand. It's because the diversity was already there, you idiots. You didn't need to expound on it. The only reason for why you felt like you needed to is because you are wokesters who can only look at things through a neo-Marxist, communist, woke lens. That's all that you continue to do, is look at the world through that. What are they protecting? I don't see how people who are saying these things think that they are fighting for good. There's a line in episode 7 where Galadriel says every war is fought from within and without. Even if you're fighting for something you think is good, if you do something worse in that fight, then you become evil. I don't see how people who are saying these things think that they're fighting for good. It's patently evil. Once again, you are not addressing what the actual criticism is, that the majority of fans, yes, of course, there's always going to be those extreme outliers of people. Yes, that's an obvious thing, but the majority of fans see the nonsense that you're doing here, where you aren't actually honoring Tolkien. If you actually wanted to, if you actually understood the spirit of Tolkien, you would look at the world of Middle-earth. You would see all the various races of people who have way more differences between them than just skin color. Their differences are way greater than just the shade of skin, like the characters that you're introducing to the show have. But you aren't focused on that, and it goes to show that you actually don't understand the world of Tolkien. You don't understand Middle-earth. You don't have an interest in honoring that, which you obviously and very clearly said in your Vanity Fair article from a few months back, where you said you're going to write the novel that Tolkien never wrote. You guys don't actually care about Tolkien. You don't understand Tolkien. You don't understand Middle-earth. And that is very obvious in this show that we continue to get, where you see weirdos wearing plastic armor and people who have terrible dialogue and a Galadriel who isn't anything like Tolkien's Galadriel, and nothing is making sense. And the writing is terrible. The visual effects are crap. Look at that warg from episode 4 or whatever it was. That was just completely terrible. With all of that being said, let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. Hope you guys enjoyed this video.